Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our last panel in our Sudan seminar series with the SOAS School of Law and SOAS ICOP. My name is Rana, and I'm a student here at SOAS in the Department of Law. I'm also a policy research assistant at ICOP, the Influencing Corridors of Power project, and I helped co-organize and establish this seminar series along with the School of Law here at SOAS. Just to give you a little recap, as we close in our seminar series, the ICOP project seeks to bridge the democratic gap between UK universities and politics by promoting policy changes through evidence-based recommendations in the form of one-page briefings on sort of that touch on upcoming and current parliamentary issues and legislation. So that's sort of like the background of how this project came about. But before I sort of go in and introduce our moderator today, I want to thank our speakers for their time and for their patience as we put this together in the past sort of like few months. I also want to thank my co-organizers from the School of Law, particularly Dr. Nada Ali and Professor Lutz Awet. Now I'll introduce our moderator, Dr. Zaid Al-Ali. So Zaid is a lawyer who focuses on Iraq, Arab constitutions and peace processes. He also published two books, one on Iraq with Yale University Press, and a second book published last year by Cambridge University Press entitled Arab Constitutionalism, the Common Revolution. He started practicing litigation and arbitration in 1999. He also worked for the United Nations in Iraq from 2005 to 2010 and has been working for IDEA since 2011. He has law degrees from King's College London, University of Paris, and Harvard Law School. He also taught law at Sciences Po, Princeton University, and Carthage University in Tunis. Thank you, Zaid, for agreeing to chair this panel, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Rana. Thanks for the offer to participate in this great event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. So the panel title, everyone should know, is Constitution Making in Post-Revolution Sudan. And we're going to be just focusing on a number of things in this panel, including the relevance of power and well-sharing models of peace building in the Sudanese context, the way historic elements weigh down on the present, the influence of international actors, and other elements that are really crucial to the Sudanese context. And also today is a big day because some of you will know that we're expecting a statement or an announcement from the revolutionary committees today in Khartoum about the work that they've been doing and the preparations in the context of the ongoing negotiations or the effort to negotiate or to reach a settlement in the current context. So we'll see if that actually happens today, but that's what's currently anticipated. So we have hopefully three panelists. It's more likely to be the case that we'll have two, and I'll explain why in a moment. So our three panelists are, and I'm reading this out in the order that it was given to me. Our first Professor Abdesalam Babakir. Our panelists will have to forgive me. I won't be able to read out all the elements of their biographies because they have a lot of achievements under their belt. So I won't be able to go over every single element, but just briefly and in summary, Dr. Mohammed Abdesalam is the Associate Professor of International Law and former Dean of the School of Law at the University of Khartoum and is the founding director of its Human Rights Center. He's the author of a book entitled Application of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights Law to the Armed Conflicts of the Sudan, which is a book that I've actually read, and it's published by Intersentia in 2007. He has many other publications as well to his name and has also been appointed by the United Nations to various positions in different East African countries. Our second panelist is Professor Sharad Srinivasan, who's at the University of Cambridge. Professor Srinivasan is David and Elaine Potter Associate Professor at the University of Cambridge Department of Politics and International Studies. He's a fellow at King's College, Cambridge, and co-director of the university's Center of Governance and Human Rights, CGHR. He has a lot of work on peace interventions in the Sudans. He's a fellow of the Rift Valley Institute and serves on the Council for British Institute in East Africa. There's a book as well, which is entitled When Peace Kills Politics, International Intervention and Unending Wars in the Sudans, which was published in 2021 by Hearst and OUP. Once again, same as with Professor Mohammed Abdesalam, Professor Sharat Srinivazan has a lot of publications. I won't be able to go over all of them in detail. And our third panelist, who if I'm not mistaken, is not with us currently, is Ahmed Ismat. And the reason why is because he's the official spokesman of the Khartoum Resistance Committee. And today's a big day for the Resistance Committee, so we're not sure if he's going to be able to join. Hopefully he will, but we're waiting on that and we'll see. But even if Ahmed isn't able to join, in any event, we're thrilled to have our first two panelists, and we're definitely going to have a really great conversation with the two of them. So if it's okay with our panelists, what I propose to do is to start in the order in which they were presented. So perhaps we can start with Professor Mohammed Abdesalam. And if I'm not mistaken, Professor Mohammed Abdesalam, will be focusing on first, the historic failures in Sudan's interim constitutional arrangements despite 3 popular revolutions, including what went wrong politically, and also the flawed stance adopted by political parties in post-revolution Sudan. And also we'll be focusing on the relevance of liberal peace model of wealth and power sharing to Sudan's post-2018-2019 revolution. So without further ado, I propose we go to Professor Mohammed Abdesalam. And if you could speak for 15 to 20 minutes, that would be terrific. We're definitely going to have a really great conversation afterwards. So very much looking forward to your comments. If you can go ahead, and we'll exchange further after your remarks. Professor Mohammed Abdesalam, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much. Please go ahead. Professor Mohammed, can you hear us? If you can hear us, you're muted. Yeah, there we go. Great.
Yeah, you hear me now, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me on this discussion, which I believe is like an important topic to talk about Sudan constitutional arrangement in post-Sudan revolution, and actually I'm going to talk on 3 or 4 pillars, focusing trying to look back at Sudan constitutional history, and also link Sudanese experience with 3 popular revolutions. And actually my first point, I'm going to look at the historical failures in since 1953, Sudan or Sudanese were not able to agree on a permanent constitution. Since 1953, 1956 and 1964, 1973, 85, 1998, 2019, and then the coup, and then also the various agreements, peace agreements. Post-revolution, there is new dynamics. So the question is actually, normally after popular revolutions, the legal arrangements and institutional arrangements actually were not enough to capture the developments after different transitions. And in my view, this is related to historically Sudan post-colonial state. This 1956, Sudan inherited a common law system, and after the independence, there is no grounds for for rule of law and constitutionalism to be actually like practiced and entrenched in the society, and also were not taken further by the political elites, especially the cardinal principles stated in the 1956 and 1953 constitutions, mainly focusing on rule of law and respect for human rights. And then the Sudan political history and the domination of the military basically affected that Sudanese could actually adopt or engage in a process of writing the constitution. And one of the key features about Sudanese constitutional development, it is actually manipulated by the political elites and the political parties, and political elites actually supporting military actors in order to entrench their power. And the main feature, since the post-colonial stage, the main feature of the constitutional arrangements is actually is not consultative, is not transparent. It is a process of constitutional writing rather than constitution making. In other words, it is actually manipulated by political elites and military actors. And then committees who wrote actually the constitutions were incapable of addressing Sudan complex matrix of governance and human rights. In other words, constitutional issues were addressed very lightly. There is no deep discussion about Sudan as a colonial, post-colonial state with regard to issues related to minorities, issues related to the relationship between religion and the state, federalism, issues related to secularism and religion, and also the rule of law aspects, including protection of human rights. So these issues were not actually part and parcel of any constitutional debate among the political elites and also among military actors. The dilemma also, actually, the process of writing the constitution is further tarnished since 1983, and then forward since the eruption of the armed conflict in South Sudan, and because now the arrangements, the constitutional arrangements in the country became like extremely difficult, because here you have military actors controlling territories like the SPLM in South Sudan, and then later in 2003 the eruption of the armed conflict in Darfur. All these aspects actually introduce a new phenomena in the Sudanese context, that peace agreements and peacemaking became actually connected with constitutional arrangements. And this has created a lot of difficulties with regard to which norms or niche constitutional norms will prevail, those who are actually agreed upon in the peace agreements or the constitutional framework. And this is a key dilemma in Sudan, because peace agreements became actually the framework upon which constitutions were designed. In particular, I'm very critical about what we call as the liberal peace model of wealth and power sharing in Sudan since the signing of the CPA 2005, and then it was replicated in 2006 with the signing of the Darfur Peace Agreement, with the Darfur Peace Agreement, and then the Doha Peace Agreement, the Doha document for peace in Darfur 2011. All these peace agreements basically, or mainly, the constitution is actually revolving revolving within these peace agreements. And then, by implication and by nature, these agreements are basically represent, as I referred, focusing only on sharing the wealth and power between the elites, the military elites, and aided by political elites, and again failed to address Sudan fundamental issues related to for example, the relationship between the center and periphery, issues related to the massive the massive violations committed in Sudan, for example, in South Sudan, in Darfur, in Blue Nile and South Kordofan. The issues, for example, related to transitional justice were not addressed in the society, issues of impunity, issues of commission of international crimes. So the model is actually mainly focused on getting back to rule the country through the key elites, rather than actually addressing the key issues and the aspirations of the public. And this dilemma, there is a lot of issues could be raised about this. If you want to assess, for example, the CPA between 2005 until secession or independence of South Sudan, we can clearly see that the status quo was not changed. Sudan was not democratized under these peace agreements, although the model of the CPA was actually celebrated widely and also supported by the United Nations and also the international community. But practically after the secession of South Sudan, we can easily say that the model failed because Sudan seceded, and then you have two repressive states in the south and also in the north, and also if you look at the legacy with regard to the adoption of laws related to like criminal laws, evidence laws, and also laws related to media and trade unions, there is no actually fundamental changes happen in the society. And then there is a huge hope after after the Sudan post-revolution, after the collapse of Bashir regime. There is great hope that Sudan will fundamentally change in terms of democratization and in terms of rule of law and in terms of constitutionalism. However, this has not happened because for a key reason. One is related to the constitutional arrangement itself, which is actually reflected in the 2019 constitutional declaration. It adopts the same method as previous agreements like CPA and another INC, the interim constitution 2005, and the partnership between the military and the FFC, the freedom forces were actually were behind the revolution. The constitutional document was very classical, it is not like a document which is, if you look at it, if you examine it, it is not a document which will bring fundamental change in the society, given that the revolution is like a wide revolution reflecting all the aspirations of the society. It does not address fundamental and key issues related to governance, the issue of regionalism, federalism, an issue, and also new phenomena like issues related to security sector reform, reform of the judiciary, reform of the army, and reform of the security sector, and also, and above all, also transitional justice issues. So what is expected during this period is actually for the constitution to be able to be detailed and to address the key concerns the key aspiration of the Sudanese people who are actually made the revolution. So the document remain an elitist document without actually being able to agree on a constitutional framework. And this is one of the key failures, that the constitutional declaration does not respect the aspiration of those, especially the youth groups, or those who made the revolution. So this is why it does not reflect the aspiration of the society. And actually, this is one of the key failures, which is actually affected actually not affected, but actually led to people not actually believing in the political forces, or actually ruled during the two first years of the transition before the military coup. Because people became frustrated with regard to the constitutional norms related to transitional justice. For example, there is no breakthrough in this area with regard to, for example, how Sudanese could actually be reconciled with their past, in particular with regard to international crimes committed in Darfur. What kind of model, for example, to be part of the constitution in order for the constitutional arrangement to be able to address what kind of model for transitional justice. No model was actually proposed. Also, other issues related to the justice reform. There is no specific reform happened with regard to the judiciary, and also absence of the constitutional court. So all these deficiencies definitely affected Sudan's smooth transition towards democracy during the transitional period. And one of the key, and one of the actually reasons which led to a lot of frustration in the streets, and also leads to that the military came back to rule again, because there is no, at the time of the revolution, there is no a comprehensive vision from the policymakers and political parties to be able to agree on a constitutional design. So now the question is, now Sudan is in a critical position. You cannot move even backward to end the coup, and also to go back to the 2019 constitutional document, which has a lot of deficiencies, but actually this is the only framework which we could work toward until the end of the transition. Briefly, now there is, since the coup, since last year, there is many proposals, some of them adopted by the, there is one document adopted by the bar union, circulated widely, and also celebrated and commended by the international community, and also the FFC. In my view, I believe there is a lot of loopholes with regard to this document. Maybe during the discussion, I can raise some key points about the gaps in these documents. There is also other frameworks adopted by different charters by the resistance committees at the level of Khartoum, and also at different levels. Luckily today, they are going to sign the main charter for change, for revolutionary change. The document have also some gaps, but at the same time, it represents a new force. And I think this is a key development in Sudan. Because now you have the revolution brought the new actors, including resistance committees. Any political agreements in Sudan without the resistance committees could not be viable. And also then you have civil society organizations who are actually playing an important role during the revolution. So the main point I would like to raise here is actually Sudan post the revolution is different of Sudan, like actually before the revolution, because now you have multiple actors, you have a wide revolution, and any constitutional arrangements it is inevitable to actually to capture, and also to capture and also to satisfy the aspirations of all the Sudanese. Then the model of wealth sharing and power sharing is no longer a viable model, and now the challenge would be that we need to, as Sudanese, with different models proposed by the Bar Union or proposed by FFC or proposed by resistance committees or the SPLM, Abdelaziz Al-Helo, we need to actually, what is needed is actually to have all these frameworks to be like guiding documents, not for a discussion about an interim constitution. We need to go immediately towards the popular discussion towards the adoption of a permanent constitution or a constitutional arrangements. But this has to be done not through the old model, like bringing the key actors to sign an interim document, but it has to be through an inclusive constitution making process. And such process is actually, it has to be aided by independent commissions, like Law Reform Commission. It has to be also informed by transitional justice. It also has to look at the issues of legitimacy and governance, because the current model of interim arrangements is going to lead to interim appointments for a prime minister or for other ministers or governors, and also interim institutions. In my view, in order to break this evil cycle, it is important that the discussion should go beyond agreeing again within the transitional period to agree on another interim constitution. It is important to actually, for the sake of agreeing on a legitimate government, and also breaking away from the evil cycle of interim constitutions, there is a need for that the discourse should change from adopting interim constitutions towards actually finding a vehicle or a process which will actually lead for a permanent constitution. And I believe this could be done through, as I mentioned, through the establishment of independent commissions, independent from the executive, in order to pave the way for a genuine constitution making process, which will actually include all Sudanese, and particularly the youth groups, civil society, and other political actors. I think I took more I will stop here, and then if there is any questions, I will be willing to answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mohammed. Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting, and you raised some extremely interesting points, not just for Sudan, by the way, but also for other countries in the region. Certainly my own, and Iraq and in Lebanon suffers from the same sorts of problems that you raise. So we'll certainly have some questions for you after we hear from Professor Sharaf. And some of the questions that we'll raise will relate to this issue of power sharing that you raise and possible alternatives. You've given us some hints about the sorts of things that you think should be focused on, but I think in the discussion it'll be very interesting to discuss that in more detail and how you see that coming about in practice. So we'll hand over now to Professor Sharaf. To note that I've looked at the participants list, and we have a really interesting crowd of people within the attendees. I don't know everyone, of course, but we have some leading scholars on Sudan who are present, and some friends and colleagues who are in Khartoum currently, working for different organizations and different groups. And also there's a few people from UNITAMS, from the mission. I mean, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but so no names, but there's a pretty diverse and interesting group of people amongst the group of participants. So, hopefully that'll feed into the discussion afterwards as well. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Sharath. He's given us an indication of what he'll be focusing on, and amongst other things on the international dimensions of failed peacekeeping transitions in Sudan, the role of the resistance committees as actively seeking to reconstitute Sudanese politics, which also relates partly to what it was that Professor Mohammed Abdeslam was focusing on, and also crucially, not just for Sudan, but for other countries as well, what can we learn from failed foreign-led peacemaking in the Sudans? So without further ado, I'll pass on to Professor Sharath. If you can keep it to around about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll move on to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zaid, and really great to be here. Very grateful for the invitation to join this panel and to listen to others, Professor Mohammed, and also to hear the discussion and questions from what is a great audience. So I will keep this relatively short on the 15-minute side of things, very much with a view to opening up the discussion and turning to questions. And I really just want to use a few provocations and contrasts to try and get at a slightly different way of thinking about constitution making that's especially important in this particular moment in Sudan in this particular time. And I want to start with a quote. It's a quote from a very distant time and place, but I think it's quite a nice quote to capture something of importance here. And it's a quote from Thomas Paine writing around the American Revolution and independence in the United States. And he says, a constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government. And I start with this quote because I think it's easy to forget its essential point, the act of a people constituting a government. And in that sense, when we talk about constitution making, in some senses, it's perhaps the wrong phrase, because it implies there is an object, the constitution, and there is a verb, which is the making of it. But what this Paine quote makes us think a bit differently is that the very actions that people are taking, the debates, the discussions, the assembling, etc., towards forming a government and, in a sense, delegating authority to a government under certain terms is the process of constitutionalizing government and of the process of constitution making. And that turns us away from objects, written texts, institutions, structures, all of which have an important role to play, but sometimes they take the place of the process by which people are constituting their government. And so if we take the Paine quote a bit further, he says something else. He says that a constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government. And government without a constitution is power without a right. And if you consider that, that suggests that government without the people constituting government is a power without right. And that's a very Republican idea of constitutions. And in some senses, it's a very particular theory of constitutions and what they are. It's rather different to a liberal model, etc. But it sort of matters in the context of countries like Sudan, where long-standing instability, upheaval, violent conflict, and fraught relations between different peoples and government and state, in a sense, reflects this problem of power without right, historically a challenge that has to be overcome. And in that sense, political founding or these moments of reconstituting that are not linked to political action and civil political action engaged in that process can be dangerously unfounding. It can actually cause further unraveling because it creates power where right doesn't exist. So that's, I guess, in a sense, the broad thematic theoretical context within which I want to make some points. And what I want to do in my contribution is focus on how sometimes international interventions in the context of Sudan, the failed peacemaking interventions and the failed transitions in the context of multiple civil wars over recent decades, reflect a further problematization and disruption of this process of constitutionalizing government. So sometimes undermining and making the problem worse. And I really will echo some of the comments that have already been made by Professor Mohammed in terms of the CPA here. But I think that contrast of what goes wrong with foreign interventions, including all the way up until the post-revolutionary events in Sudan, why these foreign actors and foreign interveners often see this as a very different exercise and process from an idea of a people constituting a government, how that causes further problems and undermines the process of power being based on right. I think that's a very valuable way to contrast what it needs to be very differently done in the present, what emerges as some of the interesting elements and qualities of the work of the resistance committees, but also some of the challenges they face. And I hope that might be useful to contribute to this debate. So historically dominant foreign peace interventions in Sudan's wars spoke about constitutional review and reform, enacted interim national constitutions, as in the 2005 interim constitution that followed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. But repeatedly, they undermined rather than fostered effective processes of constituting government or constitution making. And in turn, that reinforced violent instability. So I'm thinking about the CPA, the DPA, the Darfur Peace Agreement, but all the way to the Juba Peace Agreement that followed the revolution in 2019. And that actually those repeated mistakes have come to undermine this process of constitutional transformation. Crucially, repeatedly, these peace interventions and these peace agreements downplayed or deferred or distorted the civil politics within the country, the sort of civil political action of whether it be civil opposition or broader organizations, social movements, different spaces in which civil action and dialogue could be shaping a new future. Rather than fostering that, in the name of trying to protect that or provide a new dispensation for that, often the interventions undermined that kind of politics, downplayed them or diminished them. And they did this often because they thought that solving the problem of conflict and crisis in the country followed three dominant models, and each of which in a sense is not constructive for supporting a constitutionalizing process. So those three models, in a nutshell, one is around elite bargains, and we've heard about the problems just before of power sharing and wealth sharing, coming from a sort of conflict management sort of school of thinking of getting elites, armed elites mostly, to strike deals about sharing the spoils of state, in effect. The second is a kind of liberal democratic peace building model, which repeatedly put the hopes of popular sovereignty and civil politics and post-war politics into a transition bucket that related to an election milestone further down the track and related institutions connected to that. And the third was a focus on technocratic sort of state building, experts shaping institutional designs of the state, focusing on public goods delivery, etc. And so the combination of these three things, elite bargains, focus on electoral transitions and constitutions protecting those electoral processes, and technocratic state building, all of which privileged templates and work plans around what it was to come out of conflict that actually undermine civil politics and the location and place of civil voices and civil processes in shaping a new government. And I think the most striking version of that going wrong is not actually in Sudan, but actually with South Sudan. Because if you look at the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005 leading up to South Sudan's independence in 2011, you see a rich language around constitutions and a lot of importing of idealized templates of what constitutions should provide for in terms of protection of rights, institutional arrangements, etc., from multiple other places in the world where constitutions had been fashioned after war, after civil war in the sort of post-Cold War period. So all of these sorts of ideas, expertise, etc., brought to bear. Meanwhile, an elite sort of stitch up that put a former or authoritarian rebel movement into power and in control of the state. And all the way to what should be the founding of a new political community, a new sovereign nation. But when did the South Sudanese, at what point did they ever get to shape their new state, their new nation, their new government? There was actually, rather than founding a new sort of political community and a new state, it was really a violent process of unfounding, all because of these models of elite bargaining, electoral sort of focuses on institutions that are milestones for peace, quote unquote, or a heavy focus on technocratic state building. All of this displacing a focus on bringing people together to shape their new government and country. And in some senses, this might seem idealistic, that it could have been otherwise or different in the context of a really heavily war-ravaged and war-torn country. But of course, the legacies of doing things that way are stark, and as seen in South Sudan ever since independence. And this is deeply disturbing, because on the eve of independence, the constitution that was fashioned for South Sudan, which increasingly revolved around the executive authority of the president, ensured that the constitution gave exceeding power to purely the presidency and not even the wider executive or the legislature. And that was all possible because of a particular way of thinking about what peace should mean, or what a political transformation should mean, that international actors had really resourced and supported. So I think South Sudan is a sort of salient case of how things can go really wrong when these dominant models that come from foreign actors seeking to intervene, to manufacture and fabricate a kind of political transition go wrong. And I want to contrast that with obviously what's happened with the revolution, the resistance committees in Sudan, and the transition period, and then finally the coup, and what's happened since the coup. And in some respects, the first point is that the transition repeated many of these past mistakes, right? So I talked about a focus on elite bargaining and the way that power sharing repeatedly becomes a dominant constraint on real transformation. We saw that with the way that the Juba peace agreement came about and its impacts. The heavy focus on a kind of technocratic idea of a transition, and that the technocratic way of thinking about what needed to happen, whether around socio-economic reforms or other reforms, clearly was evident in the transition as well. And then obviously a heavy transition focus on an election sort of milestone of transition to civilian rule. Now, none of these in themselves are wrong or wrong-headed, but I guess what I want to say is that the dominance of them repeatedly undermines other aspects that were so central to the revolutionary period and the struggle, and namely the assembling and coming together and power of civilians seeking to effect dramatic political change in their country. And that was manifest especially, but not only, in the neighborhood resistance committees. And what we found really was that they ended up the guarantors of the ideals of the revolution. So when things went wrong with the coup, and a range of actors, whether it be armed rebel elites, some of them, not all of them, or some of the technocrats surrounding the original civil military arrangements, some of the international actors, deeply concerned to protect the transition, as if the transition was the primary thing that needed protecting. Whereas the real guarantors and protectors of the overall ethos and spirit and aspirations of the revolution were the resistance committees and the civilians who really took to the street and took grave risks in order to protect what they sought to achieve. And I think what became really striking there was that the transition no longer itself meant anything important. It was the revolution that was still being sort of held onto and protected. And for me, that's quite striking in one important way, and that is that these actions and these mobilizations and these coming together and the debates and the discussions within individual resistance committees about what they will or will not tolerate in terms of the further changes that are coming about now, the debates that are ongoing around the Bar Association's constitutional document, what may happen today in terms of what comes out of the coordinating committees, etc. These, for me, are the constituting actions and moments that are shaping Sudan, that are sort of the essence of a people constituting, in a sense, a government. And it's not because I think the resistance committees are all, in a sense, perfect or representative, etc., of the civilian population at large, but they represent a particular aspect of this process that is very, very important. And so I think the emphasis I would like to put here is on the idea of the constitution making process and what lies ahead as not about the promulgation of a constitution as a legal document, but the constitution making process and the process of a people constituting a government as what has been ongoing and continues to be ongoing in the ongoing, enduring efforts of the resistance committees, the Forces for Freedom Change, and other actors to try and debate and exchange and engage in what government should be and how it should be shaped, and actually a greater focus on process and these ways in which the wider citizenry and population are involved in the process, not necessarily through a formal structured consultation model, although that might also be important, but also in how we enable and open up and protect the spaces that do already exist in which people come together around these issues, is critical to something that is a lasting and a sustaining and transformative constitutional reform in Sudan. So I want to end there and look forward to the comments and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Professor Sharath, and thanks to both of the speakers. It looks like our third speaker isn't here with us yet, or maybe won't be able to join at all. So what I propose to do is to move straight into the discussion. So for those of you who are listening, if anyone would like to participate, please put in your question in the Q&A function. You should see it at the bottom of your screen. We already have 2 questions that were put in and that we'll get to in a moment. I'm going to, as always and as expected, abuse my position as chair to ask my own series of questions. I've got at least 2. Let's see how long it takes to get through them. And if there's time, I've got plenty of others. But what I'll start with, and this is a question for both of the speakers, and maybe we can take it in the order in which you first delivered your presentation. So maybe Professor Mohammed Abdel Salam first. My first question is about this element of power sharing. So, a colleague of mine said to me recently that power sharing is dead, right? So, I'm not exactly sure what she meant by that, but I think what she might have meant is that it should be dead, right? But sadly, it still isn't dead because it's still in place in many places. Although we can really see the impact that power sharing as a model has on countries in the mid to long term. It really eats away at any form of civilian politics, and to use the term that Professor Sharath used before, and sort of like a race to the bottom in terms of governance and corruption and so on and so forth. And you can really see the impact of that everywhere. You don't need to just focus on Sudan, but we also see it once again in my country, in Iraq, where it's basically unraveling at the moment, and in Lebanon, where it's led to a complete bankruptcy of the state. It's really horrific, the type of impact that it can have on a country. But to go to my question is, if we're going to set aside power sharing in a place like Sudan or in a place like Iraq, the practical aspect of avoiding power sharing, this is a really difficult question that I've been trying to deal with for years, and I don't have a clear solution. Is how does one avoid power sharing when you have an actor like the military, like the security services in Sudan, on the one hand, and in Lebanon or in Iraq, where you have very powerful militarized actors who refuse to abandon power and who will only accept to avoid going to war on the condition that they are part of government, right? How do we avoid that from a very practical perspective? Is it a question of tactics, of sort of like muscling them out of power over the mid to long term? Or what is it? How does one achieve it? So, I mean, you're free to focus on Sudan, or you can answer more generally if you would like, but please, I very much appreciate your thoughts about this. So please, Professor Mohammed Abdeslam, please go ahead. And then Professor Sharaf.
Thank you, Zaid. This is a very difficult question actually to pose about how this will be resolved, because myself, even I'm struggling with looking at Sudan context, and I'm trying to see how we can resolve this very critical reality, particularly after the coup, and also particularly after the maneuvering of the military. Basically, the military is actually smartly maneuvering in different is actually playing tactics. For example, in Sudan, the military say, okay, we are not going to be really involved in politics. Come and take for the civilian. If they agree, this is the thesis of General Burhan. If you agree, then we can hand you over the power. And this is a very deceptive discourse adopted by the military, and also at the same time, key political forces are actually buying such kind of discourse in terms of rushing and trying to adopt the same model as before, which is sharing power with the military, but this time through very soft and indirect manner, because now the military say we are going to be away from ruling the country, and we leave it for the civilians. But at the same time, there is no detailed constitutional arrangements. Even the Bar Association, document, which is unfortunately welcomed by Troika countries and also welcomed by other political actors, it is silent completely on the role of the military. Basically, the design of the military will go to a body called the Council of Defense and Security. And when you look at the provisions related to the Council of Defense and Security, there is no any details about the powers or the oversight between the military and the civilians. And this in Sudan, what we call it, the soft landing approach, which is actually now the international community, some political parties, they feel that there is a political fatigue, and then you cannot have the revolution cannot actually move forward. The intervention of actually also international actors, especially the regional groups like UAE, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, all these are actually playing very negative role. And I think here the problem with resolving this context is the issue of not people are trying actually to constitute themselves and to move forward in order to own the revolution. But at the same time, the regional dynamics, the international approach, even the United Nations, the unity mass, the peace missions, they are not really pushing the critical agenda to help the masses in order to move forward. It's still the discourse of power sharing is still there for the sake of stability. This is the only proposal made. What is alternative? I believe the alternative for power sharing or wealth sharing is actually what I call it the Sudanese popular DB state moving forward with its popular agenda in order to create a new reality. And the new reality is actually the military will not be able to govern Sudan. And I think the important role to help the Sudanese revolution is actually to support the civil society groups in order to move forward with their agenda. Yeah, I hope I managed to answer.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Thanks very much for that. Professor Sharath, please go ahead.
Yeah, those comments were very good. I mean, I think that you can see the power sharing question on a few different angles and axes, and obviously one of them is usually between different political actors of different stripes, but then obviously when you include the military into that, it's both about the sort of civil and military transition as well as the power sharing question. And in some senses, the armed rebel groups made that blurred those lines, right? Because in a sense, why would the military stand back and stand out of having representation in government when this peace agreement has brought other militarized actors who also ostensibly are political into the space of government? And I think that really messes with this idea that what's going on is a transition out with the military moving out of government. And so that goes back to this other problem of these elite bargains with armed actors and how they actually relate to a civilian transition. So certainly that element made things much worse. You're right, in a sort of in a pragmatic sense, things must move in steps, and a transition is a transition. Status quo power is status quo power. I think what's interesting is to not focus on the designing and calibrating of the power sharing agreement and its transition in a slightly scientific idea of how it all might neatly work, which usually never works. But actually to focus on for every element of power sharing with erstwhile militarized or authoritarian power, what's the counterweight? What's the guarantor of this not sort of going south? Because I think that the salient lesson of the transition in Sudan's case of the last couple of years is that the one actor that was not really part of the transition, or one group of actors that was not really part of the transition in any formal sense, was the neighborhood resistance committees. And that was the one actor that ended up being the only actor that could protect the revolution. All the others ended up fundamentally unable to, or compromised, or wedded to a transition that needed to pull back the military into being a sort of a bona fide partner. And the reason why was because it retained its counterpower. It retained its ability to act independently with autonomy and to assemble and to amass a certain counterpower force. Now you can idealize that, it's dangerous, it's really risky, it's not sustainable, we shouldn't valorize it when it's actually people putting their well-being on the line. But fundamentally, it evidences the way in which this, I think, needs to work. And I really do echo what Professor Mohammed said, which is that you have to create an alternative reality on the ground. And so the people constituting themselves, the people enacting a certain type of government, and I can see questions come on, about in the channel about dual power arrangements, but in some senses, it is so important as a counterbalance to this problem of status quo power reproducing itself in a new guise. And I'll just end there by just saying I think that's one of the real salient lessons of the Sudanese experience, which is actually quite different to a lot of other experiences in the region, because of the resilience of this counterpower that's really understood how to retain its power and keep rejuvenating it, not easily. So, but it's been a very important lesson for us all, I think.
Okay, so thanks very much, both of you, for that. I mean, I thought that was really, really interesting. And there's just a huge amount of things to think about. And this idea of dual power may end up being the historical contribution of the Sudanese revolution. We'll have to wait and see, but it's really critical and very, very interesting. But my second question just relates to what it was that Professor Sharath mentioned just earlier, which is, from a comparative perspective, today it appears that the neighborhood resistance committees are, the protectors, the guarantors of the revolution. Originally, however, back in 2016, 17, 18, and 19, it appeared that the FFC was, this heroic, strident and vanguard force. And now it appears that it's really fallen apart. And at the time, the FFC was really what distinguished the Sudan's revolution from other countries in the region. And I say region, when I say region, for me, as someone who lives in Tunisia and is from Iraq, I mean other countries that participated in some way in the Arab uprisings in 2011. And if you look at Tunisia, if you look at Libya, if you look at other countries, there was no organized political force in any of those countries. It was very spontaneous coordination, yes, but there was no organized political force that was pushing that with a strategy, so on and so forth. At the time, it appeared that the FFC was really this incredibly strident and organized and determined political force. And now it appears that it's fallen apart, right? Or at least that it hasn't held to its promise, let's put it that way. And now this another group another political force has taken on that role. So my question for both of you, and perhaps we can take it again in the same order, is what went wrong with the FFC? What was, was it wishful thinking simply on the parts of people like me? Or was there something in the way in which it acted, in which way it conceived of itself, and the decisions that it took that led ultimately to it not playing the role that many people were hoping that it could? So please, Professor Mohammed first, and then we'll move to Professor Sharath, please.
Okay. Actually, the FFC has not led the revolution. The revolution was actually led by the SPA, the Sudanese professional associations, and those who are actually the real force behind the revolution at the time is actually civil society groups, civil society organizations, like doctors' unions and other organization who are actually for the past 30 years, they are coordinating and doing a lot of work on the ground, and they played a very good role. So the revolution was actually led by the SPA and other civil society groups, but later when it comes to arrangements, constitutional arrangements, FFC hijacked the revolution at that particular moment, and then move forward. And 1 year after the revolution, one of the critical mistakes committed by the FFC is the adoption of the GPA, the Juba Peace Agreement, which is actually completely changed the political setup. It actually complicates the context, the situation, and the Juba Agreement, which in my view is actually constitutionally illegal, because it actually amended the constitutional framework, and this is obviously against any constitutional norms. And even in there is some provisions in if there is conflict between the peace agreement and the Juba and the constitutional document, then the Juba peace agreement will prevail. And this is very critical. It was done. Even it robbed Prime Minister Hamdok from his own power, because it introduced 25% of the cabinet who are actually from the rebel groups. And also, the FFC also amended the constitution in order to move the technocrats away from government, in order to bring political those who are actually have political affiliations. And so this is why, in my view, the FFC actually failed. It actually lost the trust of the Sudanese people. There is huge, sizable, many Sudanese, they believe that the FFC was actually one of the key actors who are actually contributed to the Sudan will actually to the coup that's going to happen, and this is one of the critical aspects. FFC also freezed all the governance institutions during the transitional period, including the the Legislative Assembly, not constituted after 90 days. Also played the Constitutional Court was not also established. Commissions, independent commissions as engine in order to move forward the transition, including transitional justice and constitution making an election. All of these were not created. So so this is why the FFC is completely failed. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that. Professor Sharath, please.
Yeah, I just want to add just a couple of small points here. I think one is that there was this real problem, as in many of these kinds of processes of transition and change of representation, of who represents a wider body politic that has been engaged in a revolutionary struggle, and the civil political opposition parties, and primarily coming into that gap and seeking to represent the revolution and perhaps problematically so, but it raised the other problem, which is who else would as well, and then that yielded to a number of other problematic moments, one of which was the JPA and the acceptance and willingness to accept its problematic status vis-a-vis the constitutional declaration, but also just how it eroded the civilian part of the civil military arrangements. But then also the accommodation of a more technocratic style government in the civilian transition, and that really suited some actors well, including international donors, but was really, I think, took out the legitimacy of the transformational process of the transition that civilians would have expected, and that further undermined the FFC as well. So I think this question of representation became really stark, and you can see that in the responses of the resistance committees, of being deeply distrustful of any representative structure, including from their own committees towards the FFC or towards any other body, struggling with this question of representation and really trying to maintain direct democratic models of operation, which is obviously difficult to sustain beyond a certain point. So I think this also bleeds into the question of, well, what kinds of representative structures emerge out of the resistance committees that in its process of constituting an alternative mode of self-government, and that's I think what we're in the process of trying to understand now.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, and thanks to both of you for those really interesting answers. So right now we've got 5 questions that were put to us in the Q&A function. And also one of the attendees, Mohammed Al-Ghannam, has raised his hand. So I think we'll take them in the order in which I saw them. So we'll take the 3, there are 3 Q&A questions. I'll take first, then I'll ask Mohammed Al-Ghannam to ask his question orally, then I'll take the other 2 questions that were in the Q&A. And if there are other participants who would like to ask a question orally or in the Q&A function, please go ahead. So the first question is from Aida. And the question is, I'll read it out, is why are the constitutional dynamics we see today different than the ones we've witnessed in the past? Is it distinctive? We have now 47 minutes left, so I'm assuming that we'll get more questions. So maybe if we could try to accelerate the answers. I don't think you have to be extremely brief, but if we can try to be a little bit more brief in your answers, that way we can make sure that we get as much as we can out of the Q&A. So maybe we'll just keep taking it in the same order. Professor Mohammed Abdel Salam, if you could give your view about that question, then we'll pass on to Professor Sharath. So the question is, why are the constitutional dynamics we see today different than the ones we've witnessed in the past? Is it distinctive? Thank you. You're muted, Professor. Professor, you're muted. You have to unmute.
Yes, sorry. The dynamics are different because the revolution is actually now representing different and wide sectors of Sudanese society, including the resistance committees. And now the old model will not work. You need to have constitutional arrangements to capture the aspirations of the Sudanese people. And this is the challenge. You need to have an inclusive process. So this is why it is different. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Sharath, please.
Yes, I mean, I just that same point about the street is still occupied, right, in a sense, in a figurative sense, but it's not just occupied, it's actually manifesting a different type of form of self-government, of holding on to the ability to enact an alternative mode of government. And that's very different because it's in previous cases, it's always been delegated over to some kind of representative parties, political parties, professional association representatives, etc. And then progressively that's meant things have been undermined in the transition. And I think accommodating this is the new challenge and new opportunity as well.
Sorry, I had a technical problem and I think it's resolved now. So thanks for that. Thanks for your patience. I'm sorry. I'm afraid I missed your answer, but I'm sure it was terrific.
It was brief and done. It's fine.
Okay, great. Okay, and now my challenge is that I can't see the Q&A questions. So what I'll do with the permission of the organizers is that I'll pass on to Mohammed Al-Ghannam, who's in the audience. Mohammed, please introduce yourself in the way that suits you best. And please tell us if you would like both panelists to answer or just one. And in the meantime, I'll ask the organizers, I don't know if you could copy and paste the Q&A questions into the chat function between us. That way I can see them again. Thank you. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dai, and thank you very much for hosting a very interesting discussion. Please allow me first to introduce myself. I'm Mohammed Al-Ghannam. I'm currently the constitutional advisor for UNITAMS in Khartoum. And it's a very interesting discussion, and thank you both for having it. And of course, the third panel member is not going to join because as we speak, they are currently declaring the RC's charter, the Resistance Committee's charter, which is a relatively long document, if I may say so. It's a 50-page document that we've had been reading through the last few days. A couple of comments, if I may. One is that I think one of the issues that we want to discuss is that there is a big difference between a transition constitution or a constitution, an ad hoc constitution made for a transition period, and a more permanent constitution that Sudan is looking forward to. And all what we've been discussing in the last few years is how to go through the transition period, as you've all explained. But I think it's premature for us to discuss the arrangements for a more permanent constitution. At a certain point before the coup, we have reached that step by having a draft law from the Minister of Justice and discussed the constitution making process, and we were about to have popular consultation on that, and then the coup happened, and of course we're back to square one. So that's also a big difference, that we're now all of us are back to square one, and we're having another discussion on another transition period, on another transition constitution. The SBA document, as you've all mentioned, and Professor Mohammed Abdel Salam mentioned, seems to be, at least to me, and this is not a UNITAM's opinion, this is mainly my opinion, seems to be the leading document that has at least some considerable consensus from the civilian components around it. Yes, it's not a perfect document, we all know that, and it could be definitely better, but at least it's gathering some political consensus around it. And so I actually have a couple of questions for you. I don't want to take your time. One is about the SBA draft, and that's also another question in the Q&A, and that's for both of you. How can I personally see the Bar Association document as a negotiating document. It represents the civilian. It's definitely not representing the military or even responding to some of the compromises that the military want to see in any partnership coming forward. But is there a room for having a compromise in that document to incorporate the military, the military demands at least, Is there a room for having a better document, a better consensus around it? Is there a room also for the well-known factor, the resistance committees, and if I may add also the Communist Party, to join such documents, to join the civilian component? So that's one. And if not, or you think otherwise, or you think that it's not holding enough, could be the RC's charter a replacement for that? You know, they are now issuing a document. I think, again, it's a one-sided document. It makes, and that's all the initiative that we've been reading lately. All the initiative makers, if I may call them so, are the sole holders of the future of the transition period. So FFC or the SBA document or SRF document, or even documents came from political parties. They all put themselves as a representative for the civilian component, and they make themselves the decision makers for the transition period. They want to select the prime minister, they want to select the future bodies, they want to structure the governance components for future Sudan, at least for the transition period. RC's charter is also the same. So could the RC's charter be a document that can replace the SBA component and work as at least a negotiating document between the civilians themselves? Can it gather the enough consensus, or is this premature, or we think that there should be a third document that compromise some sort of a political agreement between maybe the military and the civilians? Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks very much for that, Mohammed. Thanks for the question. So we'll put that to both panelists, I think. Maybe on this occasion, what we could do is we could ask Professor Sharat to answer first, and just to mix things up a little bit, and then pass on to Professor Mohammed Abdel Salam. Professor Sharat, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just listening to the updates and thinking about the comments that were made rather than have a strong or clear answer to this. But I think, I mean, no one of these documents is, I think there's two questions here about interim versus a more permanent process. And I think it is right that to blur those lines a lot more, and whether it's a permanent process from the outset, a constitution making process from the outset or not, I think is hard to be certain about. But it is true that to date, the interim arrangements have reflected status quo and dominant voices rather than actually being transformative. And then they've embedded and cemented and sedimented that problem. So you get stuck in the interim being a reflection of the past and not a reflection of what might transform in the future. So I think that's a really valid, still remains a valid point, but it is hard to get around. I think on the latter question, which I understood to be about the scope of possibility for some of the alignments around the Resistance Committee's charter to grow. I mean, it's very hard to know without looking at it more closely. And I don't think that it's not surprising that it's a 50-page document. It's not surprising that it's taken a long time, and there's been a lot of negotiation around text, and there's all of that. I guess I'm less fixated on the document and whether people are going to align to it as a specific document, whether it's actually fully well-formed or perfectly formed. It's a moment in time. It's a step in a process, but what it represents is a kind of process that has been very absent so far in any other constitutional documentation that's come out of any other structure, which is a long process of consultation engagement amongst multiple bodies that consider themselves sort of directly democratic in their function and coming together around something like this. And I think that process itself is very important. So this document matters more because of how it's come about than all the exact specific provisions. I think aligning to it is about continuing it as a process rather than sort of signing on it as a document, because as a document, I can't imagine, I haven't looked at it, but I can't imagine that it's a perfectly cooked kind of framework for a permanent constitution or anything like that.
Thanks very much for that. That was really interesting. Professor Mohammed Abdel Salam, please.
Okay, thank you, Muhammad Ghanim, for your question. Yes, I think the first point I'd like to make is the Bar Association document is not the answer. It contains 4 key gaps. One, as the document actually mentions that all appointments of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, appointment of the judiciary, of the Constitutional Court, of commissions, all must be actually, all these institutions must be appointed by those who sign the agreement. So, and this is, in my view, will actually compromise the independence of core institutions, which are really important during the transition. So I think this is the key gap. The other gap is also related to that. It refers to Juba Agreement as integral of the Constitution, and Juba Agreement is very problematic in terms of the design of Juba Agreements, problematic in terms of wealth and power sharing, and this will create a lot of problems with other actors, including the resistance committees. And also one of the key gaps in the document, what I can see, there is no details about the relationship between the military and the civilians, and also to what extent the military will be working under the oversight of the civilian government. It refers to a body called the Security and Defense Body, but there is no any details about that. And this is very critical. In my view, the military will leave, as we say in Sudan, from the door, and they come back through the window, and unless you actually state the powers very clearly. And this is one of the key gaps. Your question whether the resistance committees the answer, I don't think they are the answer, because even now the resistance committees, are they a pressure group or a political party? And I think this is an area need to be really addressed. In my classes, I keep asking them in their popular functions, we need to situate well the position of the resistance committees. But my proposal, I believe all these arrangements, the resistance committees charter and the bar union draft, and even the Juba agreement, and also the declaration of the Hilu, all these supposed to be are guiding frameworks that could be accommodated, and they could represent a base for the permanent constitution. And I need to address this point, if you allow me, because it was raised by Amal and also by Hamid. And in this political context, I believe we need to, rather than agreeing on a document, and I believe it is very difficult to agree on one unified document, given the division between the FFC itself and also the position of the resistance committees and also the Sudanese Communist Party. There is no real possibility for a group to have the monopoly over the constitution at this particular moment. And I believe then we need to go directly to constitution making process, so that people could own the process of the constitution making. How this could happen, I believe there is some technical levels. For example, the military say, now we are going to leave the power. Okay, then the Burhan can hand over power through issuing a constitutional decree outlining the powers, outlining the governance institutions, and which actually has to be dictated by, has to be actually informed by that he should subject himself to the civilian oversight. And the key issues, the key priorities should be like immediately establishing commissions, but they have to be independent in order to move forward with all these different documents, which could be regarded as a base for the constitution making process in Sudan during the transition period. But to agree on a political agreement among different groups, I believe it is very difficult and critical at this particular time, because it is unlikely they are going to agree, given the division between different political actors and also social groups. Yeah.
So it looks like they dropped off. So I'll go ahead and read one of the questions asked as well. Let's see. This is from Rabab and Naeem. For both speakers, would you say that Sudan is heading towards dual power situation? If yes, how can resistance committees move forward from a political charter to a constitution? Do they need to? If yes, what can we learn from Chile's constitution making process? Perhaps Professor Absalam, you can go ahead first since you have your mic open, and then we'll take a response from
Sure. I think we are not yet going towards or heading towards a dual power situation. And even if so, this will be very critical. You have like multiple actors in the scene who are actually yielding different powers. You have the military, and then you have their political supporters on one side, and then you have the rebel groups who signed the Juba agreement, and then you have the resistance committees and the FFs. And this is very critical in the Sudan context. And so I think there is multiple actors. How can resistance committee move forward for a political charter to a constitution? This has to be done through constitutional framework and constitutional mechanism. They cannot just go for a political charter, because the question is actually they need, if even they want to assume power, they need also to think about how to organize themselves as a political force rather than a popular force. And this is a question for the resistance committees to answer. And I believe if they have a political charter, so they could be like regarded as a political group. But I think they are far away from forming a solid political organization because of it is a vertical organization, and it takes a lot of time for them to agree on a unified charter. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy just to add briefly to that. I think that's right, and I mean there's a couple of important points. One is that the resistance committees are a particular, I wouldn't say it necessarily just a pressure group, but they represent a certain type of counterpower, and that's very important at the moment. It has been very important in recently, but it's a very limited constituent base as well. If we think about the processes that are involving the citizenry at large in the constitutional process, we need to think about rural Sudan much more extensively, and think about other groups, and what we take as valuable from the resistance committee is an example of something, but it's not the totality of that possibility of engagement, of dialogue, of involvement and participation of the citizenry in the process of shaping the constitution. That's a much larger process, and I do think that in some senses it's more valuable to have the resistance committees demonstrating a kind of different politics and a kind of different political action and collective action than necessarily assuming or presuming that they can transition to being a coherent political force or group, take the place at the table of representative politics, or shape or take the place of government, take a dominant place in government or shape the constitution. I think that's taking this too far. They represent a certain type of counterfactual to the way that politics is usually being done, from which to take ideas and guidance for how to expand that space of possibility, but that themselves cannot be expected to bear the burden of the entirety of the transformations that are required.
Great, thanks very much for that, Professor Sharath. So I want to apologize to everyone because I've been booted out of the room now for three or four times. I'm not sure what the problem is, but it's something to do with the app, and I can't figure it out. But anyway, hopefully it won't happen again. But next question is from Hamid Khalif Allah. And the question is directed to Professor Abdulsalam. So of course, we'll ask him to answer. But if Professor Sharad, you would also like to chime in, then please make sure to do so. So the question is, I'd like to ask Professor Abdulsalam about his proposal to focus on permanent constitution making. How would he imagine this without working out viable interim arrangements, including an interim constitution? So please, Professor, your reactions.
Thank you, Hamid. This is a very important and difficult question as well. But let me put my thesis on that. It is absolutely now difficult to go into a peacemaking process or to have a political agreement, because the military managed to manipulate different actors, and they managed to create a lot of divisions among different political forces. And even if we assume that a peace agreement or a charter will be adopted to govern the transition, the dilemma, maybe you are going to repeat the same mistakes as committed by Prime Minister Hamdok in the past, because political forces are going to start again to manipulate the political scene in terms of appointments for the judiciary, in terms of appointment for the commissions. And even if you read the charter of the Bar Association, it is the same methodology, same message. My proposal, as I mentioned briefly, is based on the fact that maybe there is a need to have a transfer of power for an appointment of a caretaker government through to be actually enabled through a constitutional decree outlining that the military that are going to leave power, including one, to initiate the process for constitution making through creation of independent commissions, namely the constitution making commission with independent personalities, and also the commission, the transitional justice commission, to at least to adopt a model for the transitional justice, and also an election commission in order to work in parallel once we have at least a constitutional framework. And I think this has to start. This is the only way I can see. But the problem is actually to what extent the military will be ready to honor what they said. But maybe politically, political forces must be shrewd enough to actually take them to their limits and adopt like practical solutions in order to hand over the power.
So, but Professor, just on that point, I mean, that's the crucial $1 million question, right? So how do you make a political force like the military, like the security services, hand over power? Usually they demand guarantees in order to do that. And sometimes the guarantees involve maintaining power, at least partial power. And even when you do give them guarantees, it's usually not enough. I'm talking comparatively, of course, right? In many places around the world, you'll give them guarantees, and then still they won't be sufficient for them, and then they'll move forward and be more aggressive shortly afterwards, which is in part what happened in Sudan between 2019 and 2021. I mean, what you appear to be suggesting is that social revolutionary forces should be sufficiently savvy, sufficiently tactful to be able to maneuver the military into a position where they would be forced to hand over power. But how realistic is that? Is that achievable? Has it been done in the past in another context? Those are some reactions to what you said.
Yeah, you are right. It is a very risky process. It has done before in Sudan history, when the military, after like pressure from the people, managed to at least they moved and hand over power. So this could happen with resistance from the research committees, from the civil society, international pressure from outside. So this could happen actually to keep, and even now there is some other factors, including the economy. These all, but it has to be orchestrated. It has to be done in a very tactical manner, and also it has to be very strategic move. But the risks are there.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Professor Sharath, please.
Yeah, not much to say more than that. But I see another question from Hamid that's about sort of the reconciling peace agreements and constitutional documents. It's a very big question and a big problem. And too often the constitutional document has emerged out of the straitjacket of the peace agreement, right? That's been the repeated sort of process, the Interim National Constitution in 2005, the constitutional review and reform process that was ensued after 2005. It was put to me by Abulalia, who was the sort of the commission president at the time, that look, no one's going to come up against really, this interim constitution from within the party signatories to the agreement, because it sort of undermines their position, and no one else is willing to sort of go along with the idea that this is actually a real constitutional review process, because they don't feel like they have sufficient voice, because they're not represented in the initial power sharing agreement or the initial representation within the assembly. So I think it is true that these peace agreements straitjacket constitutional review processes, and that part of what needs to be done is to align, to prioritize the constitutional process to the peace agreement process much more firmly. And I think that means aligning these actors very early on to the process of opening up the political space to involve others. And this is very easy said, much more difficult to do. But there are cases where that's what the parties are agreeing to from the outset. They're not first focusing on how they can share and secure power, how they can secure power if they're in power already, or how they can share in power in terms of spoils. They're sort of agreeing to the fact that this is a process of transition from the outset, and that seems to be repeatedly not the case in the Sudan case, which is actually the parties coming to the peace agreement are trying to solidify and stabilize a certain type of share of power rather than open up to transition. And from that position of power that they retain, try to project any further change from undermining that power. And I think that really just comes down to, it comes down to two things. One, it comes down to where the leadership comes from that is going to actually drive that vision of change. And in where it's happened in the past in Sudan, it's happened partly because the military has seen that there's a compelling public-facing argument about this change that people are behind, that the military has to sort of cede its position, and it's compelled to do so. But I think the other point is that, yeah, these social and political forces have to retain their potency during these periods so that they can play this tactically, because when they sort of give it up to the formal transition process as it's sort of laid out in some document, that's when these things get undermined very quickly, because they've lost their position to hold it to account, or to counter when it's being undermined or violated.
So, but Professor, so I mean, what you're describing is sounds really, really interesting and really terrific. But it sounds like what we're talking about is at the same time a legal revolution, a political revolution, a social revolution, all based on a commitment from the grassroots to mobilize, to remain mobilized, and to remain on the vanguard. So it sounds, terrifically ambitious, very difficult to achieve. I think you also said that it's more difficult to describe than to actually do. I think you also said that there are cases where this has happened. Could you point us to some situations where it may have happened, or I don't know if I misheard, but I think that is what you said.
Well, the cases I was thinking about, sorry, that was more to do with peace agreements and constitutional transformations actually being more aligned and in lockstep. whether we often, two are used as an example, but the South African case is that, right? In effect, it's not sort of strictly a peace agreement, but it is. At first, it's a political détente between two firmly opposed sides that then locks in a process of constitutional reform, like the formation of an interim constitution to form a sort of national assembly that then goes through a process of constitutional reform and writing, and that for better or worse that worked, but it was a very different set of politics and between two particular concentrated actors, one who understood its time was up. That's very different to now. But yeah, I take your point that what is being described is in a sense sort of quite idealized. I think the thing that I hold out hope for, though, is that the kind of leadership that emerges when it knows that it has at its back a mobilized social and political revolutionary struggle on the street that is really willing to protect an idea of what this revolutionary moment is about, that the kind of leadership that can emerge from that can be very different from when that's not there. So what we I think waiting to see is not to assume that the resistance committees can take the helm of political power, which I think is a bit misguided, but rather to understand what kinds of credible civilian representative leadership emerges that understands that it has that force and support and constituent base behind it and can actually be trusted and considered legitimate by that base. So where does leadership emerge from is the question, because that opens up a whole different set of possibilities about how to then bring the contending elites from the military or from the arms groups or etc. To see that this is the compelling way forward. That's what's yet to emerge, but I suspect that's what will emerge quite soon as well, is that where does leadership come from other forces that then can align to this to this power of the resistance committees themselves.
Okay, great, thanks very much for that. And we have I think a reaction to my question to you from Ahmed Hamdan, who says Northern Ireland may be another place to look to. So maybe we can also put that same question to Professor Mohammed Abdel Salam, and then we'll move on to the final question from Lutz Oued. So the question, Professor Abdel Salam, from Hamid, this is the second question, was could you reflect on the issue of reconciling peace agreements and constitutional documents and perhaps share comparative experience? And we heard Professor Shara's responses to that. Could you perhaps give us your thoughts on that same question?
Sure. I think it is one of the critical aspects of the Sudan, as I mentioned earlier, about reconciling peace agreements with different documents. I refer to the CPA, and then later I refer to the DPA and DDDPD and later the Juba peace agreement. I think the model should not be based on this duality between peace agreements and constitution making. And I think because this is in itself is a flawed methodology in terms of bringing actors to the negotiating table and then to agree on a constitutional framework. So I think this model, in my view, should not be reconciled. It should not be followed. Peace agreement should be part and parcel of the whole dynamics. Should be part should be part of related and contributing as part of other actors, including civil society, resistance committees and other actors. And I believe now there should not be like a reconciliation between the peace model and the constitutional model. We should actually move beyond that discourse and then go towards a holistic approach, which is inclusive, so that the constitution could be owned by many Sudanese and many actors. And I think this is the only way to break the evil cycle, as I said earlier, of duality between peacemaking and constitution making.
Thanks very much for that, Professor. So I think this is going to be our last question. So we have 10 minutes left. We may finish a little bit early. Let's see how it goes. But the last question now is from Lutz Ouet, and it's in the Q&A, so I'll read it out. It says, to what extent does the legacy of suffering and ongoing willingness to suffer for the sake of a principled alternative vision of Sudan vest the revolutionary committees and others across Sudan superior constitutional legitimacy? If it does, what scope is there for any power sharing that does not fully acknowledge these sacrifices? So maybe we could take it in the order of the original presentations. So maybe Professor Abdesalam, and then we can move to Professor Sharad. And feel free while you're speaking as well to add some final remarks about the discussion that's taking place and about the prospects for Sudan in the near to long term. And then we can perhaps wrap it up afterwards. So Professor Abdesalam, please, your responses to the question.
Yes. Thank you, Lutz, Professor Lutz. I believe we have a lot of issues raised in our book on constitution making and human rights in the Sudan. And if I understood your question perfectly, I guess there is a lot of sacrifices in Sudan need to be acknowledged. And need to be acknowledged by both, as you rightly mentioned, domestic and foreign actors. And I believe it is key to focus on transitional justice. And transitional justice never became part of any constitutional debate in Sudan. If you look at the CPAs, there is very tiny provision focusing on that there should be a healing process for Sudanese in order to come to terms with their past. But there is no any mechanism, credible mechanism, to actually address historical grievances. And I think this is an important component, need to be part of future Sudanese constitutions and future constitutional arrangements. And although this is not like normative constitutions, normally they don't detail such kind of arrangements in their basic documents, but I think it is important to acknowledge these through constitutional arrangements. The legacy of suffering, and as you rightly mentioned, and Sudan as a country of a country actually have a track record of committing not only normal violations, but committing international crimes. A country where you have as the first head of state being indicted by the ICC, and also under Sudan is under for 30 years under the special procedures and the UN Human Rights Councils. All this context is really important for Sudan, for the constitution. Any constitutional arrangement, even if they are interim, they should be like a model, including truth-telling, including accountability. And I think this has to be at the heart of the Sudanese debate. And this is not just like an academic exercise. It is like part and of the real and genuine aspirations of the Sudanese people. And this is what I call it the historical, there should be like a historical agreement, even including the military, that what happened in the country is not acceptable. It needs to be tackled through a transition, a genuine transition. The previous government, actually, Hamdok government, failed to address such kind of issues, only focused on development and economy. Other issues I think is important, which is normally neglected in many Sudanese constitutions, which is a right-based approach to constitutions, issues related to health, education, and services. They are very absent. And I think this is also related to of the hegemony of the liberal-based approach about the liberalism and how implanted in Sudan through different constitutions. And I think now it is important and imperative that Sudan should move forward towards actually acknowledging these facts, these historical facts. My final remarks, actually, I would like to actually stress that the power and wealth sharing model is no longer viable and applicable in Sudan post-Sudan revolution. Although there is a lot of challenges now after the coup for the revolution, but I believe in Sudan there is a new era. It has to be captured. It has to be supported by international actors. And I think even in terms of constitutional models, and I see a lot of challenges, as they mentioned in different countries. While reading your book about constitutions in the Arab region, I believe as if I'm reading Sudan through your book in different examples. So I believe the dilemma is not only focusing on Sudan, but I think it poses really critical constitutional matters about how you address societies in transition, how you design constitutions. If you look to, if you review constitutional traditional books on constitutions, you cannot find the answer. So I think there is a new era of scholarship. It has to a new approaches has to emerge in order to address these such critical emerging issues in the region. Thank you, and thank you for all the questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for that. Professor Sharat, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just, happy to add something briefly. I think that, I mean, what Lutz points to in terms of the wider legacies of suffering is really important. And most of that has happened usually in silence or at a distance and not as much in view of the elite processes that have then determined the outcomes of these wars, etc. And what is different today, I suppose, is that to some extent the resistance committees, largely because they're urban, largely because they're largely younger educated constituent base with a strong grip on media and getting their sort of word out. They were and suffering to hold on to their principles. They've made much more visible the experience and suffering of people in seeking to stand by their principles and claim something different for their future. And I think what it has meant is that it's much harder for some of the expediencies to be tolerated and gotten away with. It's much harder for some of the foreign actors to sort of hold on to neat transition models and just try to bring things back to how they were, to find some accommodation that allows the roadmap to be maintained, etc. Because in their face and in the public's eye is the struggle for something different and better. And so I think the expediencies are much harder to get away with, and that includes for a range of actors, including foreign actors, but also domestic ones. And that creates a new compelling fact on the ground that has to be dealt with. So I absolutely agree. From there, I think as Professor Abdul Salam has really indicated quite clearly, is the need for a very different kind of process of reckoning with the past and bringing forth a new idea of political dispensation, idea of the country, idea of the nation and its future. And it's an important. The point I would just sort of stress at the end of all of this is just to reflect not on what the resistance committees as such represent for their charter being part of the future constitution process, or them being enacting what or their role in political government as a political force, but to reflect on what that process of them coming into being and retaining their political potency has been all about, and how it it provides the strongest counterfactual we've had compared to all of these elite processes for so many years that have really undermined genuine transformation. And then to think about where else can that be brought to and brought about, including, as I said earlier, in areas, especially rural areas, that are far removed from some of these dynamics of urban politics. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Professor Sharad.
Thank you as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And, this has really been a great discussion, extremely interesting. I mean, of course, it's always difficult to be enthusiastic about a topic when we're talking about such huge amounts of tragedy. But it was really the right time to organize this. So I really want to thank the organizers for taking the time and making the effort and for putting together this panel. I think we agree that power sharing is dead or should be dead. It's no longer viable, to use the words of Professor Mohammed Abdeslam. And I think the challenge, the struggle, is to find the right alternative and the path to the alternative. And perhaps we're seeing the path being set out before our eyes. And at least for me, time will tell. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out. So thank you to the organizers. Thanks to both the panelists, and thanks to everyone for participating. I think we're at the end of our discussion today. And thank you for caring about Sudan. And hopefully we'll see you all soon and in good health. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
very
Zaid.
much.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Sharath, Professor Mohammed Abdeslam, for being here tonight, and for closing a very timely panel, as in coordination with what's happening in Sudan and the signing of the charter. I do want to end with a short announcement. So we're very grateful. Let's see. Are you?
We can hear
Okay. You're seeing everything. Okay. So we're very grateful to host some of Khalid Al-Bey's artwork. As you know, Khalid Al-Bey is an award-winning political cartoonist. He currently have an exhibition at SOAS on campus called Meanwhile in Sudan, or Al-Hasil fi Sudan. It is an exhibition on the complex and often unsettling events unfolding in Sudan. So if you're on campus, if you're at SOAS, if you're in London, this is open to the public as well, head to the Khalili Center Lecture Theatre foyer from now until the 16th of December. To observe his illustrations. If you're online and if you're not in London, do go ahead and scan the QR code and it will direct you to his Instagram page so you can follow him and hear more of his prolific artwork. Thank you for being here, and good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.